we're obviously at a crossroads in history. There are decades which are more important than others, and many of the political differences that we were able to downplay or largely ignore through the 90s and early aughts have become sort of unavoidable. And I think there's a difficulty when it comes to the fascist question. Well, how exactly do you deal with this? I mean, how do you meaningfully address the rising tide of fascism? Liberalism provides us some of the work. It's through liberal progressivism we're able to identify many of the political qualms that fascists take. After all, when fascists, run for political office and complain loudly on social media, they're usually doing so along some kind of anti-progressive line, something to do with immigration or race issues, concerns about transgender people or women's liberation. It's usually something to do with the fundamental questions in human rights, not so much about economic inequality, which the fascist often deprioritizes, instead advocating for class collaboration to ignore the differences between the wealthy and the poor, because, you are all at the end of the day white or men or cisgender or something. But how do you deal with this, right? And I think, obviously, if anyone had an easy answer for this, they would be quite a bit more famous than I am. But the first step is to understand exactly what motivates them. There are people sometimes who quite naively believe that everyone is motivated by this innate altruism, and people just have descriptive differences, different beliefs about the world in which we exist. So some people believe that if you sat a racist or a sexist down and explained to them some very basic demographic information, you could convince them to not be what they are. That everyone is just, a brief trip to a textbook away from being moved over to your ideology. Of course, this isn't the case, Some people hold beliefs or their convictions way more deeply than anything which can be reached with a simple descriptive claim. Unfortunately, we're just not that simple. We're not that straightforward, In reality, most people are motivated by fear. This is the presiding emotion over almost all human political behavior for as long as we have existed as a species. The wealthy or the powerful, the aristocracy or the clergy, whichever group is in power, of course, they fear losing power, They fear losing standing with their compatriots. They bankrupt their countries, building grand palaces and cathedrals. They build walls around said palaces and cathedrals because they fear peasant revolutions. The wealthy today, despite being wealthier than humans have ever been able to be for all of human history, are seemingly terrified of being taxed at anything approximating a reasonable rate. I mean, the reaction of people who make, $100 million a year when they might, in fact, make $60 million a year. I mean, you would think they're being threatened with their life. You'd think you'd have a gun to their head. But it's fear. It's genuine fear. People were just like that. But for those who don't have power, our fear tends to take more interpersonal form, often because we're told to, right? Racism, xenophobia. You can go back as far as you want, from the tribalism of pre-civilization humans to like the Crusades to the recurring waves of anti-immigration legislation that America has gone through because local white people didn't like the idea of their wages being lowered through immigration, even though the immigration ended up being an actually necessary part of economic development and ended up lifting the tide for everyone, including the native white people. But fear presides. And when people are fearful, they'll believe, all sorts of wacky stuff, really. But it's important to understand that's what they're feeling, right? The white family who lives in the suburbs who is absolutely terrified of their admin job being taken by a Mexican, this is a fear response. This is not like a rational, oh, look at the data and understand where it comes from response. The problem with understanding that a lot of politics comes right down to like very basically lizard brain emotional impulses is that if it has nothing to do with rationality, the free marketplace of ideas is no longer a valid medium for addressing political differences. The premise of the free marketplace of ideas is that the best ideas rise to the top. That is a necessary part. If it's free marketplace of ideas, but the ideas that survive to the end could be of any quality, then why do we defend this concept? Why even value said free marketplace of ideas. It makes no sense. But if people are making largely emotional decisions, we can't rely on the free marketplace of ideas to only allow the best ideas to rise to the top. I ask you what happened, of course, to all of the salient, intelligent, liberal commentators of the Weimar Republic, right? There were plenty of people who satirized the Nazis in 1920s and 30s Germany. They were, of course, shot first. And not allowed to live to see the true horrors of the administration that they failed to prevent from taking power. Critique on its own is insufficient. At the end of the day, politics is a power game. And as fascists have showed us, they have no qualms about using any possible institutional advantage, no matter how unfairly earned, to achieve power. We must do the same. It's not a matter of fair or unfair, or right or wrong. If they are allowed to do this and we do not, they will win, and the consequences of them winning are ruinous, so they must not be allowed to win. It's really that simple. It's just the system that we live in. There is no set of policies a liberal democracy can construct which cannot survive the erosion of a bad faith actor. Given enough time with enough power, any set of people, any set of institutions can wear away at a fair-minded democracy and replace it with an autocratic fascist government. So we have to be active. It is not simply enough to tell them they are wrong. They must be disempowered politically. They must not be allowed to achieve office. I think a good argument could be made that many of them should not be allowed to run for office. I don't think you should be allowed to run in a democratic society if you're openly anti-democracy. A democracy must protect itself. If it does not, then it will eventually and inevitably be crushed by the first anti-democrats to seize power. This makes no sense. Of course, institutions should seek to protect themselves, for the same reason that when a plane is crashing to the ground, you're supposed to put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on those around you. You can't ensure the system works to its best if you allow it to be overtaken by people acting in bad faith. Once you understand this, of course, and this is a deeply anti-liberal idea, because the liberal assumes that all problems can be resolved institutionally, that everything about our system is capable of navigating these problems, that you can just have neutral governance, But once you look past that, I think what we need to do moving forward really is quite simple. We need to do what we're doing, more of it and better, and we need to educate other people to do the same. If every liberal in this country were to understand the monstrosity that is the Republican Party and what it represents, then the Republican Party would cease to be a threat, because every institution in this country would be aligned against it. Unfortunately, people do not have that understanding, so we have to do our best to make sure that they do. And that, at least insofar as the context of my channel is what I try to focus on, in every possible mechanism by which this can be done should be taken advantage of. And I'm a firm believer in the value of civic discourse, of changing people's minds, of convincing them, Though I find these days my efforts are more often spent convincing liberals how dangerous fascism is than convincing fascists to not be that. It's not impossible. I do believe fascists can be deconverted. It's just difficult, The fear response is difficult, and it is strong. And we have to do something. One of the most difficult problems that left-leaning people have had to reconcile with, I think, is recruitment, bringing in new people. How do you expand our ranks, I think this is ever more important when you consider the fact that it's very difficult to move a fascist towards non-fascism. There seems to be a kind of threshold point where somebody's at some point in their life is going to be introduced to a political influence, and past that point they sort of roll down the hill they're given. And speaking of fear, there are other emotional impulses that drive our political biases. And an issue that I often see with regards to left-leaning people and reaching out is, look, to put it simply, so often the message is this: right-wing content creators or reactionary politicians or whatever else, the problem is always somebody else. Especially if you're a young white guy, which isn't, the entirety of this country, but certainly a large part of it. You will always hear that something else is the problem at hand, whether it be immigration or feminism or Black Lives Matter. It asks of you very little, other than to essentially not introspect. You're fine the way you are. The problem is all these other groups who are doing something wrong. And often the first thing that many people will hear from a left-leaning person is a demand for introspection, especially if you're a member of a hegemonic group. And you don't just have to be a straight white cisgender, guy or whatever. You can be any of these things. You can be a black guy or a cisgender woman, anything. And so often the first request is one to introspect. And I think this is often, with respect, a deeply inappropriate first ask to make of somebody, Especially since, from a leftist perspective, all the problems we face are not individualized. They're not a product of any individual human being failing to check their privilege or whatever. They're a product of systemic failures that are so far outside the bounds of any one person's pathologies that opening with a call for introspection, saying essentially things would be better if people like you check their behavior more often. This is very bad at recruiting. It makes us look quite unfun, quite serious, quite self-deprecating. It leads into a lot of nasty stereotypes about, say, self-hating men, for being feminists and the like. It's silly. People will introspect if you give them a space in which doing so is easy and beneficial and reasonable, and you give them the resources to do it. But you want to open with broader systemic claims. Weaponize anger. Be fearful of the right things to be afraid of. Climate change or economic inequality or the fact that none of us will ever be able to afford to buy a house. These are valuable directions to set people on. And it's so, so important that we come across as, likable, frankly, to people who might otherwise be turned away in favor of a much easier entry point to reactionary politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can kind of see that in when you have conversations with these people. A lot of people are conservatives because being a conservative is easy.